What happens when you drive to a pumpkin patch on a foggy Halloween evening and the old farmer mysteriously vanishes into the mist? When you rent a cozy Airbnb and discover a man imprisoned in the basement begging for help? When a child knocks on your door late at night, but something about their eyes tells you to look into the shadows behind them? Tonight we bring you 10 true accounts of ordinary moments that spiraled into terror. A student locked in a locker for hours, a woman who nearly opened her door to a predator using a child as bait, teenagers whose prank with rocks on a highway nearly got them killed by an enraged driver with a crowbar. These stories span decades and locations but share a disturbing pattern. The moment when normalcy fractures and reveals the danger hiding underneath. A college student drugged at a fraternity party wakes to find the perpetrator in his dorm room. A championship hockey team celebration ends in a car crash that kills 2 and destroys lives. A summer camp romance turns violent when a boy refuses to accept rejection. A pizza delivery driver enters an abandoned house and encounters something that wasn't supposed to be there. A postal worker receives a phone call that ends with the sound of a gunshot and threats that still echo years later. From pumpkin patches shrouded in unnatural fog to basement prisons and rental properties, from high school bullying that crosses into criminal territory to predators who use children as bait, from drunken mistakes with permanent consequences to phone calls that blur the line between prank and genuine threat. These 10 narrators survive their encounters but carry the scars. They learn that old farmers can vanish like ghosts, that locked doors might hide prisoners, that innocent invitations can be traps, and that the voice on the phone might be more dangerous than you ever imagined. Listen to their warnings and remember that the most terrifying moments often begin with something completely ordinary. I remember driving to Old Thompson's pumpkin patch on a cold October evening looking for the perfect pumpkin to carve for Halloween. The temperature had dropped significantly as the sun began its descent, my breath visible in small clouds every time I exhaled. Thick fog had rolled in from somewhere, covering the rural roads in a blanket of white that made driving feel like moving through a dream or nightmare. The GPS on my phone kept losing signal in this remote area, forcing me to rely on vague directions I'd gotten from a co-worker who'd mentioned this place sold the best pumpkins in the county at reasonable prices. I felt increasingly isolated as I drove deeper into farmland, passing fewer and fewer houses until there was nothing but empty fields on either side of the narrow road. When I finally found the entrance to Thompson's farm, marked by a weathered wooden sign barely visible through the fog, something felt immediately wrong, though I couldn't articulate exactly what. There were no other cars in the gravel parking area, no sounds of families laughing or children running through pumpkin rows like you'd expect at a popular patch during Halloween season. Just silence broken only by the crunch of my tires on gravel and the distant cawing of crows I couldn't see through the thick mist. The main farmhouse stood dark with no lights in the windows, but I could see a figure sitting motionless in a rocking chair on the front porch. As I got closer, I recognized the shape as an elderly man, presumably old Thompson himself, bundled in layers of clothing against the cold. "Looking for a pumpkin," he called out as I approached, his voice raspy like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days or weeks. I nodded and explained I wanted something large enough to carve, but not so big I couldn't lift it into my car. The old man studied me for a long moment with eyes that seemed too bright in the dim light, then gestured with one gnarled hand toward the back of the property. "Best ones are out back, past the main field. Take the path by that old truck, and you'll find what you're looking for." His directions were specific, but his tone was odd, almost like he was reading from a script or sending me somewhere he knew I shouldn't go but felt compelled to direct me there anyway. I thanked him and started walking in the direction he'd indicated, my shoes squelching in mud that the fog had made damp and treacherous. The path he'd mentioned was barely visible, just a narrow track between overgrown weeds and dying corn stalks that rustled in a breeze I couldn't feel. I found the truck he'd referenced, an ancient rusted-out pickup that looked like it had been sitting in that exact spot for decades, its tires flat and body covered in vines. Beyond the truck I found pumpkins, but they weren't the bright orange specimens I'd expected. These were dark, almost black in the fading light, with strange deformed shapes that suggested disease or mutation rather than natural growth. Some had odd protrusions like extra stems or growths. Others seemed to have faces already carved into them by rot and decay. I decided immediately that I didn't want any of these pumpkins and turned to head back to my car to find a different farm or just buy a pumpkin from a grocery store like a normal person. But when I looked back toward where I'd come from, I couldn't see the old truck anymore. The fog had thickened dramatically in the few minutes I'd been examining the deformed pumpkins, reducing visibility to maybe 10 feet in any direction. I called out for the old man, thinking maybe he'd followed me to help carry my selection, but there was no answer. Just that oppressive silence and the fog pressing in from all sides like something alive and deliberately obscuring my path. Panic began rising in my chest as I realized I couldn't tell which direction led back to the parking area in my car. I started walking quickly in what I hoped was the direction of the parking area, my heart pounding harder with each step that brought me no closer to anything familiar. The fog seemed to be playing tricks on my perception, making distances impossible to judge and sound come from directions that made no sense. I could swear I heard footsteps behind me, the squelch of boots and mud matching my own rhythm, but every time I spun around there was nothing but white mist and the vague dark shapes of objects I couldn't identify. The deformed pumpkins appeared and disappeared as I walked, sometimes on my left and sometimes on my right, making me wonder if I was walking in circles through the same patch of cursed vegetables. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 10 minutes, I stumbled out of the fog and found myself back at the front of the farmhouse. Relief flooded through me so intensely it made me dizzy, and I had to lean against my car for support. The old man was no longer in his rocking chair on the porch. The chair itself sat empty and motionless, not even swaying from recent occupation. I called out for him, thinking maybe he'd gone inside and could give me better directions, or at least confirm I wasn't losing my mind in the fog. "Mr. Thompson? Hello? Is anyone here?" My voice sounded too loud and too desperate in the unnatural quiet that had settled over the property. No response came from the dark house. I walked up to the porch and knocked on the front door, the wood solid and cold under my knuckles. Still nothing. I tried the doorknob and found it locked, which was probably for the best because I'm not sure I would have had the courage to actually enter that dark house even if the door had opened. Through the window beside the door I could see into what looked like a living room, furniture covered in white sheets like the house had been closed up for the season or longer. Dust covered every surface visible in the dim light. It didn't look like anyone had lived there recently, certainly not like someone had been sitting on the porch just 15 minutes earlier. A terrible thought occurred to me then. What if the old man in the rocking chair hadn't been real? What if the fog and isolation and my own anxiety had conjured him from shadows and wishful thinking, my mind creating a human presence because the alternative was accepting I'd driven to a completely abandoned property in the middle of nowhere? Or worse, what if he had been real but was something else, something that lured people to the back of the property for reasons I didn't want to contemplate? I thought about those deformed pumpkins, their rotted faces almost looking deliberate, and wondered if they'd been carved by human hands, or if something else had shaped them into those disturbing forms. I ran back to my car, fumbling with my keys and nearly dropping them in my haste to unlock the door and get inside. The engine started on the first try, thank God, and I reversed out of that gravel parking area faster than was probably safe. As I drove away, checking my rearview mirror obsessively, I could have sworn I saw the old man back in his rocking chair, watching my departure with those two bright eyes. But the fog was so thick I couldn't be certain, and I wasn't about to stop and verify. I drove straight home without the pumpkin I'd come for, and ended up buying a plastic one from the dollar store for my Halloween decorating. I never went back to old Thompson's pumpkin patch, and to this day when I drive past that rural area I feel chills, and make sure to take a different route rather than risk seeing that weathered wooden sign again. My girlfriend Katie and I decided to rent a cabin in the mountain for a long weekend, needing to escape the noise and stress of city life. We found the perfect place on Airbnb, a small isolated cabin surrounded by pine trees with photos showing a cozy interior and a wood-burning fireplace. The listing had excellent reviews and the price was reasonable, so we booked it immediately without much additional research. The drive up took about 3 hours, winding mountain roads that got progressively narrower and more remote until we were certain we'd gotten lost. But eventually we found the turn north to the cabin, marked by a wooden post with a property number carved into it. The cabin exceeded our expectations when we first arrived. It smelled wonderfully of pine and damp autumn leaves, the kind of organics that you only get in deep woods far from civilization. The interior was exactly as photographed, rustic furniture, warm lighting, and that promised fireplace stacked with wood and ready to light. We spent the first day hiking nearby trails, making meals in the small but functional kitchen, and enjoying the profound silence that came from being miles away from the nearest neighbor. That night we built a fire and sat on the couch reading books, feeling like we'd found the perfect retreat from our hectic normal lives. On our second day while exploring the cabin more thoroughly, Katie discovered something odd behind the kitchen. There was a small door, maybe 4 feet high, that would initially assume was just a storage closet or access to plumbing. But when she tried to open it, she found it locked from the outside with a heavy padlock that seemed excessive for a simple storage space. Why would they lock this so heavily? She asked, running her fingers over the industrial-strength lock. I shrugged, suggesting maybe the owners kept expensive equipment or family heirlooms stored there and didn't want renters accessing them. It seemed like a reasonable explanation at the time. That night around 2 a.m., we both woke to sound coming from somewhere below us. At first I thought it was just a cabin settling or maybe an animal that had gotten into a crawl space, but as we lay there listening, the sound became unmistakably deliberate. Knocking. Someone or something was knocking from underneath the floor, a rhythmic pattern that could have been mistaken for anything natural or accidental. Katie grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. "That's coming from behind that locked door," she whispered. "Someone's down there." The knocking continued, growing more insistent and desperate, clearly a plea for attention rather than a random noise. I got out of bed with my phone flashlight and a tire iron from the car, the only weapon-like object I could quickly find. Katie followed close behind as we made our way to the kitchen and that mysterious locked door. The knocking was much louder now, accompanied by what sounded like muffled shouting, though I couldn't make out any words. "Hello," I called out, feeling ridiculous talking to a locked door at 2 in the morning. The knocking stopped immediately, replaced by frantic scrabbling sounds, and then a voice, definitely human, definitely distressed, calling out, "Help, please help me. I've been down here for days. Please let me out." The voice was male, hoarse like he'd been screaming for a long time, and carried genuine terror that made my blood run cold. I remember my time on the high school basketball team with a mixture of nostalgia for the sport itself and deep anger about how my teammates treated me. I was never the best player, too short to be really competitive, not quite fast enough to make up for my height disadvantage. But I loved the game enough to accept my position on the bench and the limited playing time coach gave me. What I couldn't accept, what still makes my jaw clench years later, was a constant bullying from 3 of my teammates, Derek, Marcus, and Jake. They seemed to view me as their personal target for jokes and pranks that crossed the line from typical team hazing into genuine cruelty. It started small, hiding my shoes before practice, putting Isohot in my shorts, filling my water bottle with salt water. Annoying but manageable. I tried to laugh it off, to be a good sport and not give them the satisfaction of seeing me upset. But the pranks escalated as the season progressed, and they realized I wasn't going to fight back or report them to coach. They began focusing on psychological torment, spreading rumors about me, excluding me from team activities outside practice, making sure I knew I was considered the lowest member of the social hierarchy. I told myself it would end when the season ended, that I just had to get through a few more weeks and then I could quit the team and find something else to do with my after-school time. The incident that finally broke me happened after a particularly long practice in late February. We'd been running drills for 2 hours and everyone was exhausted, irritable, and ready to shower and go home. I was one of the last to finish, as usual, and was heading to the locker room when Derek, Marcus, and Jake cornered me near the equipment storage area. "Where are you going so fast?" Derek asked with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Before I could respond, they grabbed my arms and were dragging me toward the locker room despite my protest and attempt to pull away from their grip. They shoved me hard into one of the tall metal lockers, the kind designed to hold sport equipment and bags, big enough for a person to fit inside if they were forced into a crouching position. I tried to push back out, but Marcus slammed the door shut before I could get my footing, and I heard the distinctive click of a padlock being engaged. "Have a nice night," Jake said through the metal, his voice muffled but clearly amused. Their laughter faded as they walked away, leaving me alone in complete darkness in a space barely large enough for my body. The panic set in immediately. The locker was hot and airless, my breathing already making the small space feel oxygen depleted. I couldn't stray to my legs or arms, forced into a cramped position that made my muscles scream within minutes. I shouted for help, but the locker room was in a far corner of the school building, and if there was anyone still around at this hour, they couldn't hear me through the thick metal. Time became meaningless in the darkness. I had no way to check my phone, which was in my bag outside the locker, no way to know if I'd been trapped for 10 minutes or an hour. The suffocation fear mixed with claustrophobia until I was hyperventilating, using up what little air I had even faster. I was home alone that night, something I'd done 1,000 times before without any anxiety or concern. My husband worked the night shift at the factory 3 days a week, and I'd gotten used to spending those evenings by myself in our small house at the edge of town where our nearest neighbor was half a mile away. I usually enjoyed the solitude. Time to read or watch movies he didn't like. Time to spread out craft project across the living room floor without worrying about someone tripping over them. That particular night, I was watching a documentary about ocean life, wrapped in a blanket on the couch with a cup of tea, feeling perfectly safe and comfortable in my own home. Around 11:30, I heard knocking at the front door. Soft at first, almost hesitant, the kind of knock that might be someone unsure if they had the right house. I muted the television and listened, wondering if I'd imagined it or if it was just a branch hitting the siding in the wind. But the knocking came again, more insistent this time, definitely deliberate. My first thought was that my husband had forgotten his keys and come home early from his shift, though that seemed unlikely since he was always meticulous about carrying his keyring. Still, I got up from the couch and walked to the front door, calling out, "Honey, is that you?" As I approached. "Help me, please," came a small voice from outside. Not my husband, a child. I froze with my hand on the doorknob, every maternal instinct screaming at me to open the door immediately and help whatever child was out there alone at this hour. But something else, some deeper survival instinct that exists beneath socialization and compassion, told me to stop and think before acting. I turned on the porch light and looked through the peephole in the door. A small boy stood on my porch, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wearing pajamas and looking directly at the peephole as if he knew exactly where my eye was. "I'm lost," he said in that same small voice. "Can you help me find my mommy?" Everything about the scene should have compelled me to open that door. A lost child in pajamas on a cold night, clearly frightened and needing adult help. But something was wrong. The boy's eyes were wrong, too focused and calculating for a genuinely scared child. His posture was too still, too posed, like he was performing the role of a lost kid rather than actually being one. And most damning, I could see the edge of a shadow just beyond the reach of my porch light, a dark shape that suggested someone much larger standing just out of direct view. My hand pulled back from the doorknob as if it had burned me. I stepped quietly to the side of the door and peeked through the curtain covering the window beside it, angling my view to see past the boy into the yard beyond. That's when I saw him. A tall man standing in the shadows about 10 feet from my porch, partially hidden behind my husband's truck. Even in the dim light, I could see what he was holding. A large knife, blade catching faint reflection from the porch light. He was watching the door intently, clearly waiting for me to open it and step out to help the lost child. The boy was bait. The realization hit me like ice water, understanding that if I'd opened that door even a crack, if I'd stepped onto the porch to bring the child inside, that man would have rushed forward with his knife and I would have been trapped between them with no escape. I grew up in Queens, New York during the 1970s when the city was rougher and kids had more unsupervised freedom to make the kind of stupid decisions that seemed fun at the time but look absolutely insane in retrospect. My best friend Sean and I were always looking for excitement, for ways to inject adventure into our ordinary neighborhood lives. We climbed abandoned buildings, snuck into subway tunnels, shoplifted candy from corner stores, the typical petty crimes and boundary pushing that bored teenagers engage in when they haven't yet developed a frontal lobe capacity to understand real consequences. One summer afternoon when we were both about 14, Sean came up with what seemed like a brilliant idea for entertainment. There was a spot near his apartment building where you could access the area right beside a major highway, separated from the rushing traffic by only a low fence that was easy to climb. "Let's throw rocks at cars," he suggested with a kind of grin that should have immediately warned me this was a terrible plan. But I was 14 and stupid and wanted to impress my friend, so I agreed without thinking through what could actually happen. We gathered a collection of decent-sized rocks, climbed the fence, and positioned ourselves where we had a clear view of traffic approaching on the highway below. The first few rocks we threw missed completely, bouncing harmlessly on the shoulder or hitting the road between lanes. We laughed at our poor aim and grabbed bigger rocks, determined to actually hit our target. I wound up like a baseball pitcher and let one fly, watching as it arced through the air and, to my shock and Sean's cheering, struck the windshield of a black Subaru sedan, doing probably 60 miles per hour. The sound of impact was louder than I expected, a sharp crack that carried even over the highway noise. For a second I felt pure pride in making the hit, but that feeling evaporated instantly when the Subaru's brake lights blazed red and the car swerved toward the shoulder. "Oh shit," Sean said, the laughter dying in his voice. "Oh shit is stopping. Run." But we were both frozen, watching as the Subaru pulled fully onto the shoulder and a man got out. He was big, at least 6 feet tall, with the build of someone who worked with his hands, wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. And he was carrying something that made my stomach drop, a crowbar, the kind used for pulling nails and prying boards, but which looked in that moment like a weapon designed specifically for crushing teenage skulls. The man looked up toward where we stood above the highway, his face contorted with rage, and started walking in our direction, looking for a way to reach us. Sean and I finally broke from our paralysis and scrambled back over the fence, our hands shaking so badly we could barely grip the chain link. The man was shouting now, his voice carrying up to us, though I couldn't make out specific words over the traffic noise and my own thundering heartbeat. We could see him searching for access to our level, trying different paths and getting increasingly frustrated when none of them led where he wanted to go. In a moment of desperate inspiration, or possibly the stupidest thing I've ever done, I pointed in completely the wrong direction and shouted down to him, "They went that way." 2 kids ran off toward the park. I'm not sure he heard me or believed me, but he turned and headed in the direction I'd indicated, still carrying that crowbar and muttering what I assumed were creative descriptions of what he'd do when he caught up with the kids who'd damage his car. I was a freshman at a large state university, still figuring out how college social life worked and trying to find my place in a campus of thousands of students who all seemed more confident and experienced than me. One Thursday afternoon I saw a flyer posted in the student union advertising a party at a fraternity I'd never heard of, Sigma Alpha something, the Greek letters meaning nothing to my non-Greek affiliated brain. The flyer promised free drinks, a DJ, and the party of the semester with an address and time but no RSVP requirement. It seemed like exactly the kind of college experience I was supposed to be having, so I decided to go even though none of my roommates were interested. I showed up alone around 10 p.m. to a house on the far edge of Greek Row, a large old building that had seen better days with peeling paint and a porch that sagged ominously. Music thumped from inside, and I could see shadows moving past windows, suggesting a decent crowd despite the fraternity's apparent obscurity. I walked in and was immediately hit by the overwhelming sensory assault of a college party. Music too loud for conversation, air thick with sweat and cheap cologne and spilled beer, bodies pressed together in rooms not designed for this many people. I grabbed a red cup from someone offering drinks and started navigating through the crowd looking for anyone I might recognize from my classes. That's when I met Alex. He appeared beside me in the kitchen, a tall guy with an easy smile and expensive-looking clothes, offering to refill my cup from a pitcher he was holding. First time at a Sigma party, he asked conversationally. When I nodded, he launched into what seemed like a rehearsed welcome speech about how his fraternity was the best on campus, how they threw the wildest parties, how he was related to some state politician whose name I should apparently recognize and be impressed by. Something about him immediately set off warning bells. He stood too close. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes, and he kept refilling my cup every time I took even a small sip, as if trying to get me drunk as quickly as possible. After maybe 20 minutes of drinking whatever was in that pitcher, I started feeling wrong. Not normal drunk. I'd been to parties before. I knew what alcohol intoxication felt like, but something else. The room started spinning in a way that was too intense for the amount I consumed. My limbs felt heavy and disconnected from my body. My thought became slow and sticky like moving through honey. I tried to tell Alex I needed to sit down, needed some air, but my words came out slurred and wrong. The last thing I clearly remember from the party was Alex's hand on my arm, his voice saying something about helping me to a quiet room upstairs where I could lie down, and my brain screaming warnings that I was too impaired to act on. I don't remember how I got back to my dorm room that night. I woke up around 4 a.m. in my own bed, still fully clothed, my head pounding and my mouth tasting like I'd been chewing on cotton balls. My wallet and phone were still in my pockets. I didn't appear to be injured, but I had absolutely no memory of leaving the party or getting home. The implication of that blank space in my memory made me nauseous in ways that had nothing to do with whatever I'd been drugged with. I spent the next hour checking my body for signs of assault, finding nothing but feeling no relief because the absence of evidence didn't mean nothing had happened, just that I couldn't remember or prove it. Our high school hockey team had just won the state championship, and we were flying high on victory and teenage invincibility. The championship game had been close. We'd won in overtime with a goal from our captain Dexter, and the crowd had gone absolutely insane. We'd paraded the trophy around the rink, hugged each other and cried with joy, called our parents and girlfriends to celebrate the achievement we'd worked toward all season. Dexter announced he was throwing a massive party at his house since his parents were out of town for the weekend, and the entire team was invited to celebrate properly without adult supervision dampening our enthusiasm. The party was everything you'd expect from a house full of teenage athletes with no parental oversight, and unlimited access to alcohol someone's older brother had provided. Music blasting from expensive speakers. The trophy displayed prominently on the kitchen counter where everyone could pose with it for photos. Cases of beer disappearing at an alarming rate. I remember feeling like this was a pinnacle of my high school experience. The moment everything came together perfectly and proved that all our hard work and sacrifice had been worth it. We'd achieved something real and earned the right to celebrate without restraint or second thoughts about consequences. By midnight, most of us were thoroughly drunk. That sloppy kind of intoxication where everything seems hilarious and you're convinced you're much more coordinated than you actually are. When people started talking about heading home, four of us, me, Thomas, Kyle, and Jordan, decided to share a ride since we all lived in the same general direction. Jordan volunteered to drive despite being just as drunk as the rest of us, claiming he was fine and drove better drunk anyway with the kind of confidence that alcohol provides to terrible decisions. None of us challenged him or suggested calling parents or getting an Uber because we were 18 and stupid and immortal in our own minds. Jordan's car was a beat-up Honda Civic that he'd bought with money from his summer job, and we piled into it laughing and still clutching beer cans as we pulled away from Dexter's house. The road home included a stretch of winding mountain highway with sharp curves and steep drops on one side protected only by metal guardrails. I was in the back seat with Thomas, both of us still celebrating and not paying attention to Jordan's increasingly erratic driving. He was going too fast for the conditions, overcorrecting on turns, drifting between lanes in ways that should have terrified us but somehow just made us laugh harder in our impaired state. I don't remember the exact moment Jordan lost control. 1 second we were taking a curve too fast. The next the car was spinning and there was a horrible sound of metal grinding against metal as we hit the guardrail. The guardrail should have stopped us from going over the edge, but it was old and poorly maintained and our momentum carried us right through it. The car went airborne for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then we were tumbling down the rocky cliff face, the car rolling over and over while glass shattered and metal crumpled, and I heard screaming that might have been coming from my own throat. The final impact when we hit the bottom knocked me unconscious. The last thing I remember being Thomas's face next to me streaked with blood and his eyes wide with terror. I remember the summer before my senior year of high school when I worked as a counselor at a sleepaway camp for kids aged 8 to 14. It was my third year working there, and I loved everything about it. Being outdoors all day, teaching kids new skills, the sense of community among the staff who came back year after year. That particular summer, a new counselor joined our team, a guy named Ben who was my age and had recently moved to our area. He was handsome in that effortless way some people are, tall with dark hair and an easy smile that made everyone immediately like him and trust him. Within days of arriving at camp, he'd become one of the most popular counselors with both the kids and staff. Ben and I started spending time together during our off hours, the brief periods when we weren't supervising activities or doing camp duties. We'd walk down to the lake after the kids were in bed, sit on the dock and talk about our lives and plans and all the profound things teenagers think are unique to their own experience. He was charming and attentive in ways boys my age usually weren't, actually listening when I talked instead of just waiting for his turn to speak. By the second week of camp, we were what passed for dating in that environment, holding hands during staff meetings, stealing kisses behind the dining hall, that intense summer romance feeling that develops when you're living and working in close quarters with someone attractive. The shift happened suddenly one night during the third week of camp. We were sitting on my bunk bed in the counselor's cabin after all the kids were asleep, talking quietly so we wouldn't wake my roommate Emily, who was sleeping on the other side of the small room. Ben had been acting more physically aggressive that evening, pushing for more intimate contact than I was comfortable with, not accepting my gentle redirections and attempts to slow things down. I remember saying clearly and firmly, "I'm not ready for this. We need to stop." But he either didn't hear me or chose not to hear me because his hands kept moving and he started trying to remove my clothes despite my protests. What happened next is burned into my memory with the kind of clarity that trauma provides. I pushed against his chest hard and said no loud enough that Emily woke up and sat bolt upright in her bed, demanding to know what was going on. Ben immediately backed off, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender and claiming he'd misunderstood what I wanted, that it was just a miscommunication between two people who clearly liked each other. But Emily had seen enough to know what had almost happened. She ordered Ben out of our cabin in a voice that carried absolute authority despite her being only 17 herself, and he left quickly without argument, probably hoping to minimize the situation before it became an official problem. Emily believed me immediately and completely, which I recognize now as a gift not all survivors receive from the first person they tell about assault or attempted assault. She insisted we report what happened to the camp director first thing in the morning, not giving me time to talk myself out of it or convince myself it wasn't serious enough to make a big deal about. The camp director, a kind woman named Susan who'd been running the camp for 20 years, listened to my account, asked clarifying questions without judgment, and immediately called Ben into her office. He was expelled from camp that same day, banned permanently from ever working there again or participating in any camp activities. I learned later that Susan also contacted the organization that certified camp counselors in our state to flag his record so other camps will be aware when conducting background checks. I was working as a pizza delivery driver during my last year of college, a job that paid better than minimum wage once you factored in tips and allowed me to work evenings while keeping my days free for classes. Most deliveries were routine and forgettable: apartment complexes, suburban houses, dorm buildings where students pooled money for late-night food. But one delivery from that time has stuck with me, vivid and disturbing in ways I can still feel years later when I think about it too carefully. It was a Friday night around 11 p.m., near the end of my shift, when I got assigned what would be my last delivery of the evening. The address took me to an unfamiliar part of town, a neighborhood that had clearly seen better days decades ago and been declining ever since. Streets were poorly lit with half the streetlights broken or burned out, houses set far apart from each other with overgrown yards and that air of abandonment that suggests people have given up on maintenance and community. My GPS guided me to a house at the end of a dead-end street, a large old Victorian-style home that looked like it hadn't been occupied in years. No lights were visible in any windows, paint peeling from the siding in long strips, porch steps sagging and rotted. I checked the address 3 times, thinking I must have made a wrong turn, but the numbers matched the ordered ticket perfectly. I grabbed the pizza, a large pepperoni, already paid for online with a decent tip included, and walked up to the front door, my footsteps echoing on the wooden porch that creaked ominously under my weight. I knocked and called out pizza delivery, but received no response. The house was completely silent with that quality of deep stillness that comes from true emptiness. I knocked again louder, thinking maybe the customer was in the back room or upstairs and hadn't heard me. Still nothing. Then, while I was standing there trying to decide if I should just leave the pizza and go or call my manager for guidance, the front door swung slowly inward on its own. The door's movement was completely silent, no creak of hinges or obvious source of what had caused it to open. It just swung inward, revealing darkness beyond the threshold, that particular quality of darkness that suggests abandoned spaces with no electricity or human presence. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to leave immediately, to get back in my car and drive away and mark the delivery as undeliverable. But I've been working this job long enough to have a certain autopilot response to doors opening, and I found myself calling into that darkness, "Hello? Your pizza's here. I've got your order." My voice sounded too loud and too small at the same time, swallowed by the emptiness of the house. When no one responded, I made what I recognize now as an absolutely insane decision. I stepped inside. I told myself I was just going to set the pizza on a table or counter just inside the door and leave, make a reasonable effort to complete the delivery. The interior smelled strongly of mold and rotting wood, that organic decay smell of buildings left to deteriorate without human intervention. My eyes began adjusting to the darkness, helped by faint moonlight filtering through broken windows, and I could make out the vague shapes of furniture covered in dust. I walked further in, following what seemed to be a hallway, still calling out for the customer who'd ordered this pizza, to an abandoned house at 11 p.m. on a Friday night. I was working at the post office in a small town, a job I'd held for about 5 years that was mostly routine and peaceful. My duties involved sorting mail, helping customers at the counter, and occasionally dealing with the strange or difficult people who inevitably show up in any customer service position. One quiet Tuesday afternoon, I was alone at the front counter when the office phone rang. I answered with my standard greeting, expecting a customer asking about hours or package tracking. Instead, I heard a male voice, unfamiliar and slightly muffled, asking, "Is this the main post office?" When I confirmed it was, he launched into a strange request. "I'm calling about a petition," he said, his tone casual and friendly. "I need you to sign a petition I'm circulating about local property tax increases. Can you give me your full name for the signature list?" The request was odd. People don't usually collect petition signatures over the phone, and why would someone call the post office specifically for this? I politely explained that I couldn't provide personal information or sign petitions while on duty at work. That's when his tone changed completely, shifting from friendly to aggressive in a way that sent immediate warning signals through my nervous system. "Oh, you think you're too good to help with important community issues," he said, his voice taking on a mocking edge. "Let me tell you something. Buddy, I know where you work. I know you probably walk to your car alone after your shift. I know you have a dog that you let out in your backyard every morning. Would be a shame if something happened to that dog." The specificity of his threats made my blood run cold. How did he know I had a dog? Had he been watching me? Was this someone I knew playing a sick prank, or a genuine stalker who'd been monitoring my routine? I tried to maintain composure and told him firmly that I was ending the call and would contact police if he called again with threats. He laughed at that, a sound completely devoid of humor. "My name is Billy Joe Bob," he said in an exaggerated southern accent, clearly mocking me and making it obvious this wasn't his real name. "Go ahead and tell the police that Billy Joe Bob called to threaten you. I'm sure they'll take that real serious." The conversation continued in this vein for several more minutes, oscillating between crude insults and increasingly specific threats about what he could do to my property, my dog, and me personally if he decided I was worth the effort. I don't know why I didn't just hang up. Maybe shock, maybe some misguided sense that I needed to keep him talking to gather more information, maybe just a paralysis that comes from fear and confusion. The call finally ended in the most disturbing way possible. I heard a loud bang through the phone, unmistakably a gunshot, close enough to the receiver that it distorted the audio. Then silence. Then the click of him hanging up. I sat there holding the receiver long after the dial tone started, my hands shaking and my mind racing through terrible possibilities. Had he shot someone? Had he shot himself? Was it a recording played to frighten me? I reported the incident to my supervisor and we contacted police, but they found no evidence of any shooting and suggested it had been a disturbed individual making prank threats with sound effects. Years later, I still don't know who made that call or why they targeted me specifically. The post office installed caller ID after that incident, but it wouldn't have helped. The call had come from a blocked number showing only unknown on the display. I never heard from Billy Joe Bob again, never received follow-up threats or saw anyone suspicious watching my house. But the experience changed how I viewed my daily routines and the vulnerability of living in a small town where everyone knows everyone else's business. Sometimes I still think about that gunshot sound and wonder what it meant. Whether someone died that day because of a phone call I received at work, or if it was just another layer of psychological torture from someone who enjoyed frightening strangers for reasons I'll never understand.